The Plot to Change America, How Identity Politics is Dividing the Land of the Free, exposes the myths that help identity politics perpetuate itself. This book will reveal what really has happened, explain why it is urgent to change course, and offer a strategy to do so. The author of this book is joining me right now, Mike Gonzalez. He's also a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mike, thank you so much for coming on the Florida Roundtable today.
Thank you for inviting me, Mike, and hello to your listeners in Florida. I graduated from Coral Gables Senior High many decades ago, so I was a Floridian myself once.
Oh, okay. Yeah, now you're up in D.C. Do you miss Florida at all?
Yeah, I do. I take my children to Key West
good.
And to Miami every once in a while. But all parts of Florida are beautiful. Pensacola, Tampa. I love the state.
Okay, great. So before we get started on your book, I did want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your background and what you currently do for the Heritage Foundation right now.
So I was born in Cuba, left at the age of 12. I was a foreign correspondent for many years, including 11 years with the Wall Street Journal, 10 of those spent overseas in Europe and Asia. I've also worked in Latin America. So I spent about 15 years working overseas as a journalist. Came back and joined the Bush administration at the FCC, and then at the Securities and Exchange Commission, and then at the State Department. And then have been at Heritage for the last 11 years. I write a lot about foreign policy because I've lived overseas and worked at the State Department, but my concentration these days is on identity politics because I do think it is the biggest threat to us as a republic and to our liberties. So I devote my attention to that, devoted my book, The Plot to Change America, to identity politics.
Yeah, and go ahead and explain what prompted you to write this book.
So, identity politics is a way to divide the nation into groups that are based on race, sex, ethnicity, sexual orientation, even disability status, anything that confers victimhood upon the member of the group. Now, you have to understand these groups are oftentimes artificially created by the bureaucracy. So the problem with instilling victimhood and grievances into people is that it puts these grievances on a hamster wheel that never ends. When people are told to derive their sense of dignity or their claims on respect and attention, and even rewards and compensatory justice from their victimhood, they have zero incentive to solve their victimhood. Nothing ever gets solved. We end up being an aggrieved society in which everything boils down to power dynamics and group dynamics. It sets the nation against each other, and it never ends. It never really solves social problems for the reasons I've discussed, but it does. It can end very badly. So I love America. I don't want America to end badly. And I don't want us to lose our liberties. So I wrote a book explaining, who did this, how they did it, and especially why they did it, and how we can break out of this.
And do you feel like this is something that's new to America, relatively new, or is this something we've struggled with since the beginning, since the founding?
So I think, no, this is completely new. This is not the Dutch vote in the Hudson River Valley in the 1700s, or the Irish vote in Boston and New York in the 19th century in Tammany Hall. This new concept of victimhood is one of the things that is new, and another one is to use this victimhood to change the country from within. I named my book the Plot to Change America, not because they're active conspirators meeting in basements in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Brooklyn, New York, every Thursday night, but because this is all part of a well-thought-out approach, based on theories that aim to replace many aspects of America, especially those that created a nation that has had ahistoric levels of liberty and prosperity. My family came here because seeking that level of prosperity and liberty. In fact, 100 million immigrants have immigrated here between 1850 to the present, and that attraction continues to today because of that liberty and prosperity. There's a very long line of people out the door waiting to get in. There's no line of people here really waiting to get out. But there are some people, however, who do want to change our system, who think we can't change our system, who don't like capitalism, and they're using these grievances to achieve their purpose.
Now, when you say they're using these grievances, are some of the grievances legitimate, or are they kind of creating them, making people feel like victims that are not victims?
So, there are some legitimate grievances. African Americans have a very long history of actual, being real victims in this country. We have the centuries of slavery, followed by the century of Jim Crow. These are real issues. The problem is that in the 60s, a lot of activists came along and drew what I would say are specious analogies between their groups and the unique suffering of African Americans. And by the way, I don't think that we can solve the problems that we continue to have, with African Americans, the problems they continue to have, by instilling into African Americans, by instilling more grievances into them. I think that, we can solve, problems that they themselves say they're having with the police, et cetera, through other means. But we do have to recognize that they are uniquely, it's a unique existence in the United States. When people come along and say, well, the suffering of Mexican Americans, then Hispanics, Hispanic category is created, or the suffering of women, or the suffering of LGBTQ Americans is it's analogous to that of African Americans. That creates a problem for society. First of all, that's not the case.
Now, when you talk about how some of this identity politics is being created, and by the way, I'm speaking with Mike Gonzalez. He's author of the new book, The Plot to Change America, How Identity Politics is Dividing the Land of the Free. And is this book available now? Is it available at Amazon and all the bookstores out there?
Yes, it was published on July 28th, and it's doing quite well.
Great.
Obviously, all the issues that we're seeing all around us are helping sell the book. What we're seeing in Portland, in Chicago, what is happening in Chicago, oh my goodness, what we're seeing with the New York Times 1619 Project, or the Black Lives Matter organization, obviously not the slogan, but the organization itself. And what we're seeing with this new cottage industry of so-called anti-racism training, people like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi, all of this have to do with the things that I talk about in my book. This is an attempt to rewrite the narrative of America, its economic system, its morals, it's the traditional family, even its national sovereignty, with a very different counter-narrative. This owes to theories that go back early in the 20th century and that I explain in my book, The Plot to Change America.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, who exactly is pushing this narrative? I mean, it sounds like, there's a lot of people at the bottom that are just caught up in it because they've been led to feel like victims. But it also sounds like there's people at the top in certain areas that are actually pushing this for a specific purpose. Who exactly is doing this?
Yeah, so if you go back, for example, to Antonio Gramsci, who is the founder of the Italian Communist Party in the 1920s, he was sent to prison by the fascists to shut, quote unquote, to shut his brain, stop his brain from working. That, of course, never works. Prison is a place where you can do a lot of hard thinking. And he came up with the idea, well, look, Marx and Engels, the creators of communism, had promised that the working class was going to continuously rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, but that never happened. It only happened in a backward part of Europe, Russia. it failed everyone else since 1848. And he says, well, the reason for this is that the worker himself has accepted the cultural values of his oppressor, has accepted the family, has accepted the nation state, has accepted religion and the economic system, and the oppressor no longer needs to use the threat of violence to make the worker comply. And he says, well, this is the hegemonic narrative that has to be replaced with a counter narrative. The worker has false narratives. So this whole idea, another intellectuals come along further with critical theory, for example, in the 1930s, which is a way it's the way to replace the hegemonic narrative with the counter narrative. Critical theory is just an unremitting attack on all the norm and values of the West today. So I just told you what happened in the 20s and 30s. Today, everybody who goes to college studies critical theory. If you go to law school, you study critical legal theory. Or in other parts of the university, you will study critical race theory. If you graduate as of next year, if you graduate from the California State University system, you will have to have had classes on ethnic studies and social justice studies. These are, again, the direct heirs of critical theory. Angela Davis, who was a former Black Panther and member of the Communist Party USA, who was taught directly at Brandeis University by one of these intellectuals, Herbert Marcuse. She goes around the country today, speaks to packed university audiences, and raises her fist and says, ethnic studies are the intellectual arm of the revolution. And indeed they are. And I can go through, what were the intellectual steps to get there. But just to tell you that all this stuff that I talk about in my book, The Plot to Change America, all these ideas and theories of the 20s and 30s and 60s are being applied today throughout systematically. Our schools of education, studies have been done on the curricula of the schools of education. It's all critical theory.
I'm speaking with Mike Gonzalez. He is the author of the new book, The Plot to Change America, How Identity Politics is Dividing the Land of the Free. We're going to discuss more about his new book, what is pushing identity politics in this country, and where all of this leads. The Plot to Change America, How Identity Politics is Dividing the Land of the Free is a new book out by Mike Gonzalez, who is with the Heritage Foundation. We've been discussing this important issue. In the last segment, we were going over the intellectual foundations of the movement to kind of use identity politics to divide us, to change America. But in the last segment, Mike, you also talked about the fact that we're sort of seeing the effects of this in Portland, Seattle, other big cities where not only did they have Black Lives Matter protests, but eventually a lot of those protests turned violent, and you have Antifa and other groups really pushing almost revolution, and they're doing it all on the back of identity politics.
Yeah, that's right. This is all a direct consequence of what I write about in my book, The Plot to Change America. Antifa, of course, has been designated as a terrorist organization. Black Lives Matter is first of all, it's nobody disagrees that Black Lives Matter. First of all lives matter, and Black Lives matter a lot to me and to all right-thinking Americans. The issue is with the Black Lives Matter organization, the global network. If you Google Black Lives Matter, Google sends you to the global network. That gives you an idea of how central it is. The three women who coined the term and popularized the term Black Lives Matter in 2014 are the founders and run the Black Lives Matter global network. That is one of those three women, Patrisse Cullors, says that she and another one of the founders are trained Marxists. She says this in interviews. She did not include the third founder, Opal Tometi, but Opal Tometi is seen photographed with Maduro in Venezuela, praising him for his style of people democracy, of direct democracy. So supposedly this is what they intend to bring here. If you go on their website and you click on About Us, you get a list of demands, such as, for example, dismantling the patriarchal family, things that have nothing to do with oppression. In fact, a lot of the problems that a lot of Americans have today are directly due to the breakdown of the family. But let's go back to Patrisse Cullors and her claim that she's a trained Marxist. She indeed trained for a whole decade with the Community Labor Strategy Center, which was founded by Eric Mann, who was Eric, and continues to be led by Eric Mann, who is Eric Mann. Eric Mann was a former member of the Weather Underground, a terrorist organization designated as a terrorist organization by the FBI. Eric Mann spent time in prison for attempt to commit murder. He says to today that he trains revolutionaries who want to his intent is to bring about world communism. So, this is what the organization is. What is happening in Chicago, we have seen recently. What's happening in Portland has been happening in Portland now for weeks. Is not really happenstance. It's not. It is. It is and of course they use social media. These protests, when they're peaceful, that is not a problem to anybody. Peaceful protests are just the exercise of the First Amendment. But when they say mostly peaceful protests, well, as soon as the protest turns violent, then it becomes a violent protest. And that is an attempt, really, in some ways, to change the constitutional order of the United States. But it's not just a protest, Even things such as that are not violent in nature, which the protests are, but things that are not violent in nature, such as Robin DiAngelo's training, the so-called anti-racism training. Now, she is a very powerful woman. Last month, she trained 184 members of the House of Representatives of the United States. And she herself makes it very clear, very explicit, that she is anti-capitalist. She thinks capitalism should be replaced, that capitalism equals racism. So what we're seeing throughout all of this is really an attempt to change the system, right? If you claim that America is a systemically, structurally, and institutionally racist country, then what you have to do is change the institutions and the structures and its very system, the system being a word for the way everything works. Now, does anybody really, in their right mind, think that America, with all its bounty, should be radically turned upside down? And unfortunately, what we're seeing is a very, very, very sudden rush to do things, to change things. We've seen this before, and if our leaders make bad decisions, we may end up, living with the consequences for decades.
And you were born in Cuba, so I'm guessing that you kind of have some firsthand knowledge of what, a country not built on the foundations like America was built actually looks like.
Yeah, I mean, Cuba, that's a very good point. I lived there for the first 12 years of my life, and for the, subsequent 5 decades, I have had time to think about what happened. Cuba was a functioning society, had its problems like everything else, but it attracted immigrants. It attracted immigrants from Europe, like my grandparents. Cuba, the communism became a very successful attempt at changing Cuban culture. It replaced everything. It replaced the system. It was structural and systemic and institutional change completely. The revolution does that, and the consequences of that today is that Cuba went from having pretty good indicators in terms of economic and cultural indicators in the 50s, again with problems. Batista was a dictator. My family was against him. He threw my dad in prison. But if you looked at Cuba in the 50s, it had fairly good indicators, compared very well, especially, never mind with the rest of Latin America, compared very well with Mediterranean Europe and the southern U.S. states. But today Cuba is pauperized. It's completely devastated. Havana is a city in ruins. You can see that the buildings were beautiful, but they're now completely ramshackle and torn down. We really should think what systemic and structural and institutional change means.
Yeah, and, you bring up a lot of good points there. I'm speaking with Mike Gonzalez, author of the new book, How Identity Politics is Dividing the Land of the Free. The Plot to Change America is the title. And why is it so successful, then, the movement of a lot of these identity politics movements? Why are they so successful in getting people to join the movement, especially young people?
Well, I think there's several things, right? In the immediate, what happened with George Floyd's death was horrific. A policeman sat on his neck and extinguished his life during a harrowing 9 minutes. We all saw that. People were filled with righteous anger, and rightly so. And I think then people who had been waiting in the wings to use an occasion such as this actually seized the moment, and we saw what happened in American cities in June and July, and all of a sudden you have a lot of political and corporate leaders who are desperate to show their good intentions, as I said, making announcements and making decisions that are very bad. For example, dismantling the police department. Anybody who has seen what has happened with the looting in Chicago in the second week of August will realize instantly that the police are needed. Then there's the sudden call for reparations. Does anybody really think that a debate, or even if they actually were to happen on reparations, would do anything to make sure that the family is put together again in working class, black or white or Mexican American communities or Cuban American communities? But the long-term answer to your question as to why they have been so successful is that going back to the 60s, to Herbert Marcuse, another one of his disciples, Rudy Dushka, came up with the idea of the Long March through the institutions. The Long March was a clear reference to Mao Zedong's march through China in the 1930s, in which was one of the key steps to defeating the Nationalist Party in China.
And it totally makes sense that what they've done is they've kind of used some of the cultural institutions. And we can talk more about this in the next segment. We're just coming up on a break here, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell people where they can find your book.
So Amazon, any Barnes & Noble, The Plot to Change America, it's selling very well. For reasons that I kind of not happy about, is because what we're going through as a country. But the book is doing well. The Plot to Change America. You can go to heritage.org/theplot, or go to Amazon and get it there, or Encounter Books, through any of these means.
All right, we'll continue this conversation in just a moment. No doubt we seem to live in very divided times, and one of the reasons seems to be the obsession over identity politics. Well, my guest right now, Mike Gonzalez, has a new book on how to fight against the identity politics. It's called The Plot to Change America, How Identity Politics is Dividing the Land of the Free. Mike, in the last segment, I asked you, why has it been so successful? Why have a lot of these movements like Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and other movements that use identity politics, why have they been so successful? And you were bringing up the point that basically it's been taught in our schools and in our cultural institutions for so long.
Yeah, I mean, that's the key. The cultural institutions of the academy, media, and the entertainment industry have been completely taken over by people who subscribe to all these theories that I have been discussing, critical theory and so forth. The person who best enunciated The reason for doing this was a German revolutionary by the name of Rudi Dutschke. He was a disciple of Herbert Marcuse, whom I discussed earlier, was also a teacher of Angela Davis. Rudi Dutschke had this idea of the long march through the institutions, an obvious reference to Mao's long march through China in the 30s during the Civil War there, except Rudi Dutschke's long march was going to be peaceful. They were going to take over, especially universities, and that was a really concerted effort. Universities is where our new leaders are going to be taught. In one of the departments, one of the faculties that they really aimed at were schools of ed, where teachers are taught. Another former weatherman, Bill Ayers, after he gave up terrorism, he became a teacher of teachers. He went to Columbia, got a degree in how to teach at schools of education. Papers have been written on how papers have looked at the curricula of schools of ed of several schools, and they are the majority of the courses and the books that they teach are critical theory texts. One of them, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, stands out as one that would be taught everywhere. So this then gets translated to our students at all levels. It's not just at the university level, starting in middle school. And this is why you end up now with a situation where millennials really embrace socialism to a degree that no previous American generations have embraced. America has always been uniquely attached to freedom, a country uniquely attached to liberty. This is the reason why I called my book The Plot to Change America, is because there was a concerted effort started in the 60s to change that. In 1957, Lewis Hart wrote a very influential book, which I forget at the moment. It's going to come to me in a minute, in which he talked about how America was really obsessive about liberties, and he said the reason for that is because we had never had feudalism. So never having had experience of feudalism, we never had reactionary conservatism, we never had socialism. Latin America and Europe had feudalism, so had both. So this attachment to freedom then is something that Herbert Marcuse picks up on when he writes One-Dimensional Man. Again, one-dimensional because America, he thinks, is one-dimensional. But then he notices the riots, and even though he had despaired that the American worker was too attached to his hi-fi and his car and his refrigerator and was never going to revolt and overthrow the system, he says, aha, it isn't people of different colors and different races that we're going to have the rebellious class. He calls this, quote-unquote, the substratum of society. And he says all liberation depends on the consciousness of servitude. In other words, we must instill this idea of victimhood into the members of these new identity groups. Identity groups proliferate. The Hispanic identity is created here in Washington by the Office of Management and Budget artificially through Policy Directive number 15. Other identity groups are created. Very recently, President Obama tried to create yet another identity group, MENA, for Middle East North Africa, to identify as marginalized Americans with Arab ancestry. There are many Americans who you would know are of Arab ancestry, including John Sununu, who was National Security Advisor to President H.W. Bush, including Mitch Daniels, the president of Purdue University, former governor of Indiana, including Donna Shalala in Florida, a member of the House. They're not marginalized. And yet there was an effort to create yet more identity group. These groups must be created, instilled with feelings of marginalization and victimhood, and with the feeling that the country is institutionally racist in order to change the institutions.
So how do we fight against this? You went over a lot of details on how they've been successful in their movement to try to change America, at least successful in getting people to kind of come on board with the movement. How do we fight against it?
Well, you have to get the government out of the business of category creation. The government, the bureaucrats are not anthropologists, they're not biologists, they're not scientists. They're not there to create ethnic groups, and they're not there to say, so you're marginalized. People, we have to go back to the sense that there are problems in society. I've had problems. I don't know you, but I assume you have had problems yourself. The push was to overcome these problems and to derive our dignity from the fact that we overcame problems. We have to get the government out of category creation, and we have to get the government out of the business of giving benefits based on being a member of a category. That is a crazy way toward a society. We have tried separate but equal before. It did not work. It was a stain on our history. The civil rights movement was a very beautiful attempt at changing this separate but equal, but it was turned on its head, and decisions began to be made on race. We have to stop making decisions based on race and ethnicity and national origin. But I'm very hopeful. First, I'm very hopeful because I think the year of 2020 has taught Americans that the things we have been doing for the last few decades have not only have they not worked, they've had very bad consequences. Not just the riots and the looting, but also the pandemic. I think that we're seeing the failure of public sector unions such as teachers' unions and police unions. But it's also something else. This portrayal of society as being all power dynamics and oppressors and oppressors is a Marxist approach to life. And Marxists fail because what Marxism is a supremely vain attempt at changing human nature. Che Guevara called it the new man. They were going to make the new man. But the new man never emerges. If you read the Bible or you read the Iliad or the Odyssey, you encounter characters like Agamemnon or Achilles or Ulysses or Moses or Sarah or Abraham, and what strikes you right away is that they're just like us. They're just like you and me.
Yeah, and like you said, it's impossible to change human nature. I know you could talk about this for hours, and people who are more interested in more of what you have to say can go check out your book, The Plot to Change America, How Identity Politics is Dividing the Land of the Free. Mike Gonzalez with the Heritage Foundation, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it. We'll bring you on again in the future.
Thank you, Mike. Very happy to.